طيب الحمد لله على إحسانه وشكره على بري وامتنانه وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله تعظيما لشانه وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله الداعي إلى رضوانه أما بعد. I to praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sending praise and salutations upon the beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We continue in our study of Fiqh Seerah. Very quickly, a question that was asked by, I think it was you that asked, it was about 2 lessons ago, but it's going to be beneficial inshallah for everyone. That's why we'll quickly go at it, fine, and try to give some clarification in regard to that. The question roughly was in terms of following the majority. Roughly it was in terms of following the majority. Should we not as Muslims now follow the majority, fine, when it comes to things like fiqh, when it comes to rulings, etc. And then you could add to that, another part of the question is, if that's the case, then how could it be that we said the truth is not known by the number of people that follow X opinion? Truth is not known by the number of people, fine, rather it's known by its evidences. So how do we combine between those two statements? What we say is the foundation in regard to this issue, you could call it the sunnah of Allah, fine, is his statement in his book Tabarak wa Ta'ala, where he says, وَإِن تُطِعْ أَكْثَرَ مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يُضِلُّوكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يَخْرُصُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you were to obey most of the people on the earth, يُضِلُّوكَ, they would misguide you from the path of Allah. يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ, they follow not except speculation. Right? This is the yardstick, you could say. Fine? That if we were to obey the majority, then they would misguide us. And there's many verses in regard to this. وَمَا أَكْثَرُ النَّاسِ وَلَوْ حَرَصْتَ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ, that most people, even if you were to try hard, fine, aren't believers. وَمَا يُؤْمِنُ أَكْثَرُهُم بِاللَّهِ إِلَّا وَهُمْ يُشْرِكُونَ إِنَّهُ الْحَقُّ مِنْ رَبِّكَ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. Verily it's the truth from your Lord, however most of the people don't believe. And you find that throughout the Quran, when you do like an istiqra, when you do an extraction from the Quran, you find most of the places where the word akthar, where the place majority is used, right? It's not necessarily used in a praiseworthy manner. So we say this is the base, this is the yardstick, and what this teaches us, what do we learn from these verses, from this yardstick? We learn that the majority in and of itself, autonomously, isn't an evidence. Fine? And we mentioned, at the time we asked the question, we mentioned the hadith of the 72 sects, which is a very famous hadith. We mentioned, even though there's some issues in regard to its authenticity, we mentioned how you can use that to say that the majority isn't alone isn't a yardstick. We also mentioned the hadith of when Allah Ta'ala orders that from every 1,000 from the son of Adam, 999 be taken to the fire. Right. We do have a hadith, fine, it's mentioned from Ibn Umar radiallahu anh, that the Prophet ﷺ said that his ummah, that my ummah doesn't come together upon misguidance. Excellent. That my ummah doesn't come together upon misguidance. Fine. It's narrated by Tirmidhi, and some scholars say it's authentic. There's some issues with it. The meaning is authentic. We have a hadith and the meaning is authentic, where the Prophet ﷺ said, my ummah does not come together upon misguidance. Fine. So now how do we understand this after what I just said? The foundation, the yardstick, and the sunnah of Allah. How do we understand this now? Fine. The understanding of this is that, as we said when we answered the question, that when you talk about this specific hadith, is talking about the unification, the coming together of everyone on one opinion, fine, and there's not one person that differs. There's not a single person that differs. So this understanding of this hadith is there isn't two sides in the first place. There isn't two parties. So there isn't two parties in order for there to be a majority or minority, because there's no one differs. Everyone's together. Fine. Secondly, very importantly, the intention behind our statements when we say the consensus, when we say the majority, fine, we're not talking about anyone. We're talking specifically about the highest level of scholars that have reached the level of ijtihad. They've reached the level of independent reasoning. So very big scholars, people of extreme knowledge. We're talking about their coming together. Right? And this supports what we said earlier, that just solely the number, fine, is not an evidence in and of itself. Fine. Look at the difference. Now I'm going to make two statements, and there's a difference between the two statements. The first statement is the majority, and we said it's not an evidence. The second statement is the majority of scholars. The majority of scholars have added a description, which is that they're scholars and specialists in that field, in that science. Here the majority, you can say what? It has weight. Even then, it's not an evidence in and of itself, but what? It has weight. It gives what? It gives strength to the argument. Does that make sense? It's not something that can be taken lightly. Right? And that's why you hear a lot of the times that me or other me, anyone that you hear, they might answer a question, fine, and they might say that that's the qawl of the jumhur. They might say that this is the opinion of the majority of scholars, or this is the opinion of the overwhelming majority of scholars when they're answering questions. Does that make sense? When they say this, they're not saying the one that we said before. They're not saying that it's just because it's the majority. They say no, it's the majority of specialists and trained people in that field have taken that opinion. And so when they say this, when answering a question, it actually holds some what? It holds some weight. It gives support to their argument. Does that make sense? Do you see the difference? Does everyone understand this point? The difference between using as an evidence solely the majority, the number of people, and using as an evidence the majority of scholars. And this actually reminds me, we'll finish with that, and this reminds me of something that we was going to mention throughout our Fiqh Seerah, which is a very nice benefit, which is that the Quran, let's leave that point about the majority, but it's linked to it. The Quran, we say the miraculous nature of the Quran is in which regard? We say it's in regard to its language. We say it's in regard to its eloquence, fine? Its linguistic structure, its power in terms of clarifying linguistic effect, the power that it has. Fine? We say that's miraculous. Fine? The language cannot be replicated. And that's why you have the inimitability challenge. Fine? Which is that produce a surah like this. Allah Ta'ala says, produce a surah like this. So we say that the miraculous nature, which was known at the time when we took examples of this throughout the seerah so far, and inshallah more will come, that the miraculous nature of the Quran is in its language. Fine? A person might ask, if that's the case, I don't know Arabic. I don't know Arabic, let alone a non-Muslim. So how can we understand the miraculous nature of the Quran then? Then it can't be miraculous to us. Fine? We say here, hold on 1 second, there's an answer to the question. You have two ways in front of you. You can understand the miraculous nature of the Quran, even if you don't know the Arabic language. How? Person asks how. You have 2 ways. Fine? The first way is what? Learn the Arabic language. Very simply, learn the Arabic language so that you can appreciate and recognize the eloquence and the miraculous nature of the language used in the Quran. Mumtaz, easy. Most people won't do this. Most people do answer number 2. The second way, how does a lay person who doesn't understand the Arabic language, how does he appreciate the miraculous nature of the language used in the Quran? The second way is what? He looks to those who have spent years studying, who are trained and professionals in the Arabic language, who do understand eloquence, who do understand the different sciences and parts of the Arabic language, whether they be Muslim or non-Muslim, and he looks at those specialists in the field and he sees that every single one of them recognize, anyone who's actually spent his life studying the language, Muslim and non-Muslim, recognize the superior nature of the language in the Quran. They recognize the inimitability of the language used in the Quran. They recognize the fact that we said what? When the Quran came, it became the yardstick. The Quran became the yardstick of Arabic language. Fine? And so any lay person can come to that conclusion. So we say it's not necessary, fine, that a person need to know the Arabic, need to understand these things just to appreciate the miraculous nature of the Quran. We say a person can do that without knowing such. And in connecting to this, one of the Salaf, he said what? He said, make obligatory upon yourself the path of guidance, fine, and it doesn't harm you. This is one of the Salaf now, one of the early generations, fine. He said what? And it doesn't harm you how few people tread that path. And it doesn't harm you how few people tread that path. And don't be deceived by the amount of people that tread another path. Fine? This is like a what? It's like a principle now. Fine? We say al-haqq bidala'ilihi la biqa'ilihi. We say truth is known by its evidences, and it's not known by the person who said it, let alone the number of people that said it. Wallahu a'la wa a'lam. We'll leave it there with that, because we want to go into the actual, very quickly we want to go into the actual lesson. We finished the first 3 means in regard to the way the disbelievers have been waging war against the Prophet ﷺ. We spent a bit of time on the third one where we said it was kind of this distortion, etc., regarding the da'wah of the Prophet, the character of the Prophet, etc. We want to move on to today the fourth means, which is busying people from listening to the Quran, distracting people from listening to the Quran. Mainly they used to do this with what? With by telling tales, by telling stories. There was many different ways they would do this, but mainly they would do this by telling tales, telling stories, telling folk tales, to keep people busy. And so they don't go and listen to the Quran when the verses are being recited, when the Prophet ﷺ is given the da'wah, when the Muslims are given da'wah. Is everyone with me? Fine. Type. Is there any questions now before we get into it? Anyone have any questions with anything that's come so far? You have a question? Was that a quick? No question. Okay, mumtaz. Type. If I go too fast, someone just let me know. Now sometimes what? Because the sessions be short, we try to what? Type. Allah musta'an. Type. A quick notice, which is what? That we've mentioned this is not a sequence. We mentioned a list of the way that the war is being waged against the Prophet ﷺ, the different means taken, the different strategies used. Fine. Though that list there and the way that we've taken it, the order that we've taken it, it doesn't necessitate, that these strategies were utilized, and we've mentioned this before, and these events happened in that time order. From the second that we jumped into the means, we're just listing the means and examples of them, and we're not necessarily doing it in chronological order. And so the intention behind it is that we understand, we gain a mindset, we take a snapshot, a picture of the general climate in Mecca at that time. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we can generally say that we're roughly in the third or fourth year, after the bi'thah, after the dispatching of the Prophet ﷺ. We're roughly around that time, all of these events. This is for us to understand the general environment within Quraysh, surrounding Quraysh, their position, their mindset, the way that they treated the Prophet ﷺ, the way that they treated the Muslims. This is what we want to understand from taking these means. And so these events that we've taken, these means, is very likely that they all were applied, at the same time, consistently, whenever possible. Does that make sense? And so we have to understand now and picture it, that the Prophet ﷺ, our beloved Prophet ﷺ, is now living, and likewise the Muslims, the Sahaba, they're living in this society. The society that's using these means consistently, not just one. The story that we're taking isn't the end of, for example, the story that we took in regard to the claims that were made. That doesn't mean that was the only claim that was made. That means that claim was repeated and repeated and repeated day in, day out. And likewise, the rest of the means that we take from torture and from other than that, they're consistent. So this is the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims living between this society, this oppressive society. Is it only? And as we said, bear in mind, you have to add to that as we've already mentioned multiple times, that the Muslims are still weak. So weak that, as we took in the last lesson, they couldn't destroy the idols. They were weak to the point that they couldn't do certain legislations that required power. They required number. They required numbers. They couldn't fulfill those. That was their situation. That was their position and their weakness. And likewise, you understand that the enmity coming from the other side. Does that make sense? Likewise, we said that there are those affairs. This is now an important point coming on. Second notice, which is that, as we mentioned, there are those affairs that require some power. They require numbers, etc. That doesn't mean, when we say that they couldn't do those things, they couldn't destroy the idols, they couldn't do certain things that require physical confrontation other than that, it doesn't mean that there was no such legislation. It doesn't mean that even in this time, the early Islam, it doesn't mean there was no rulings. It doesn't mean that there was no worship. So on top of the enmity of the society, on top of the weakness of the Muslims, they still had rules to follow. They still had a deen. They still had a deen that they had to live. Is everyone with me? Fine. Rather, in that same environment that showed that level of hatred towards the affair of the Muslims, fine, there were some worships and legislations present. Fine. And obviously, some of the scholars generally differ in regard to the specific legislations, the specific rulings, the specific way they used to worship, etc. There's some difference of opinion in regard to certain things. Fine. The exact nature of said worship that was present at that early time. We said we're looking at about 3 to 4 years after the dispatching of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, they agree that there was something present there. Fine. As an example, it's said that, for example, wudu, ablution. It said that ablution and likewise the prayer, likewise as-salah, they were both legislated. It said that they were both legislated before al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. Pay attention now, because I know someone's going to say, I thought the prayer was legislated on Isra wal-Mi'raj. You're right. Understand? We're gonna answer that. I said legislated. I said that there was ablution and prayer legislated. I didn't say that there was prayer obligated. Fine? When we talk about Isra wal Mi'raj, we have to be very precise now. When we talk about Isra wal Mi'raj, the ascension of the Prophet ﷺ to the heavens, we say that on that ascension, the 5 daily prayers, as we know them today, the main 5 daily prayers, they were obligated on the Isra wal Mi'raj. Good? Fine? That doesn't negate the fact that there was a prayer before that. Fine? Type. First of all, wudu. These are just 2 examples, wudu and as-salah. As for wudu, then a group of scholars, fine, have said that it was present at that time. They didn't say it was wajib, they didn't say it was obligatory, but they said it was present. They said it was present. Fine, meaning that the rulings were taught, the rulings were understood. Fine? And there are some ahadith that indicate to this. Fine? In the Musnad of Imam Ahmed and others, there's some narrations that even indicate to the fact that ablution was present at this time. Allah knows best about their authenticity, but generally speaking, it's a solid opinion of some of the scholars. Fine? As for the prayer, then here the scholars differ a bit. That which is, you can almost say definite. Al-Hafiz ibn Hajar, one of the scholars of Islam, he says that before Isra wal Mi'raj, there was definitely a prayer. He says, qat'an, there was, without a shadow of a doubt, there was a prayer. However, the scholars differed in regard to what that prayer was. Does everyone understand? What that prayer was, and was it obligatory, or was it, if you wanted to do it, you could do it, you didn't have to do it. Fine? And so from the scholars is those that say it was, they used to have to pray 2 rak'ah, 2 units, roughly the time of Fajr. Fine? And 2 rak'ah qabla al-ghurub, before sunset, they say around Asr time. So just 2 and 2. Fine? And others say, and likewise, this is the opinion of many scholars. Likewise, obviously, the Qiyamul Layl, the prayer of the night, fine, was legislated at that time. Many scholars say this, that it was legislated at that time, fine, for the period of a year. The night prayer, that they used to come together and pray the night prayer for a year, and then it was abrogated. So even the Muslims, the lay Muslims, they had to pray many scholars say they had to pray the night prayer. And then it was, after a year, it was abrogated. That was one of the main prayers that was there. That was abrogated, but the Prophet ﷺ still had to pray it. They say that the time when Isra wal Mi'raj happened, etc., that got abrogated. However, the Prophet ﷺ still had to pray the night prayer. Fine? Because the Prophet ﷺ, as we know, if he does something, then it sticks. He doesn't give it up. Fine? Any questions up to here? Fine. So now we understand roughly. What we're trying to do is bring the picture closer to our minds, so that we can try and understand the exact situation that the Muslims were going through at that time, the exact situation the Prophet was going through at that specific time. Fine. Add to this that with all of that going on, all of these, you still have legislation, you have this enmity that you're living amongst, fine, you're weak and unable to do so many things. Add to this an important note, that with all this being said, there were still people coming to take Islam, coming to accept Islam. As is clear from the 3 stories that we took in the last how many lessons we talked about the Islam of those individuals, fine? They weren't the only individuals. And so there were individuals coming, fine, and embracing Islam. So they're on the up. However, this is still their situation. Right. Let's move into the actual means taken, which we said was what? Distracting people with folk tales and tales of legends and other than that. Fine. We've mentioned this, the verse before. I believe it was in roughly the 29th lesson. Fine. We mentioned the saying of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَا تَسْمَعُوا لِهَذَا الْقُرْآنِ وَالْغَوْا فِيهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَغْلِبُونَ. That we mentioned the saying of Allah that the people who disbelieve would say to one another, don't listen to this Qur'an. They would say, don't listen to this Qur'an. وَالْغَوْا فِيهِ, rather create noise and clamor throughout it so that you can overcome the Prophet ﷺ, so that you can overcome the believers in their attempt to spread this message. Is everyone with me? And we said that from that is that they would clap, and from that is that they would scream, from that is that they would screech, from that is that they would say things and nasty things about the Muslims, about the Prophet ﷺ, etc. and mock and ridicule. All that comes under this. Fine? And they would speak over it. Fine? We mentioned all of this, and this same verse applies here. We can use it as an evidence here. Is everyone with me? So this verse is the first proof that disbelievers would use this, would take this strategy of trying to drive people away, and so that they didn't listen and lend the Quran an ear. Likewise, every single verse in the Quran, generally every single verse, if not all of them, that mention asatirul awwaleen. Sometimes we read the Quran, you come across those 2 words, asatirul awwaleen. That basically means like folk tales, legends, stories of old. Fine? Those verses are generally speaking about, that's what they would say about the Quran. That's what they would say about the Quran, that it's just folk tales, etc., or that they would come with folk tales. Fine? And so they would advise one another. The disbelievers now would advise one another to make that noise, to make that outburst. Fine? Whenever the verses of the Quran were recited, in order for it not to be heard. If it's not heard, it's not understood. If it's not heard, it's not understood. Does that make sense? Fine? طيب. And from the biggest examples of this, and we mentioned this very, very briefly, but this applies mainly to this part of, this specific part of the Seerah, distracting people with folk tales and legends and stuff like that. Fine? Is the story of someone called Nadhr ibn Haarith. Nadhr ibn Haarith. Fine? Nadhr ibn Haarith, he was known as the shayateen of the Quraysh. Or from the shayateen of the Quraysh, he was known to be a shaitan. Fine? The heads of kufr, one of the biggest enemies of al-Islam, and he would harm the Prophet ﷺ in many different ways. Fine? And he had a specific enmity towards Islam, a specific enmity towards the Prophet ﷺ, towards the Muslims. And he was known, so this specific individual, Nadhr bin Haarith, he was known for his travels. He was very well known that he's traveled. He's gone far east, etc. Fine? Because he would go to these places, to Persia, fine, to Rome. He would go to these places and he would learn. He would learn what? He would learn stories. As it's going to come. That's our whole point, distracting people with what? With stories and tales. He would learn these things and learn the language, etc. Fine? And so the Prophet ﷺ would be in a sitting, a gathering, reminding people, giving da'wah. Fine? If the Prophet ﷺ got up, he would sit in the exact same place, the exact same majlis gathering. Fine? As soon as the Prophet ﷺ got up, and he would say to the people that, me, ya ma'shar Quraysh, me, O people of Quraysh, I'm better than him when it comes to speaking. I'm better than him. And he would then continue and say that his speech وَمَا حَدِيثُهُ إِلَّا أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ, that his speech is nothing except is folk tales. He would say that about the Prophet ﷺ, that his speech is nothing except folk tales that he what? That he wrote, that he forged himself. Does that make sense? Fine. And so he would tell the people, come to me. He would call them, he would literally call the people to him. Halumma alayh, come to me. And I'll tell you that which is better than, and I will give you stories, etc., that is better than that which he has said. And then he would mention stories of the kings of the lands that he's visited, kings of the stories of Rome, the stories of the legends of Persia. If anyone's heard of the name Rustum, fine. Fine. And so this was the issue of Nadhr ibn Haarith, and this clearly demonstrates the application and the usage that the disbelievers had of this means, which is what? Which is distracting people, which is turning people away by keeping them busy. Type. And that's all we generally need. We're going to mention some verses, but that's generally all we need to understand this means. Inshallah, we'll try to finish this means, this lesson. Type. Very quickly, this specific narration and the stories about Nadhr bin Haarith, it's very important for us to know, as we do in the end of every thing that we bring. We try to quote its source. Fine. This isn't mentioned, from my little knowledge. Someone else might have some more knowledge. From my little knowledge, this isn't mentioned in terms of chains of narration, which are like hadithi. It's not mentioned like books of hadith. This is mentioned by one of the most famous biographies of the Prophet ﷺ, which is the biography of Ibn Hisham. It's called Seerah ibn Hisham. It's one of the most famous biographies of the Prophet ﷺ. It's the go-to book. Fine. It's mentioned in there, and obviously branches of that and other books in regard to the Seerah. So it's written in the books of history, you could say. The books of history and the books of Seerah. That's very important to note. Fine. With that note being made, there's verses of the Quran, clear verses of the Quran. Fine. That specifically clarify with no doubt that these type of means were taken. And we mentioned one already in the beginning. Fine. Rather, Ibn Hisham himself, he says that in regard to this individual, Nadhr ibn Haarith, he said in regard to this specific individual, this is why he's quite important, that we should have him in our head. Even when we read Quran, we should have him in our mind in certain areas of the Quran. Ibn Hisham actually says that about this specific individual, he says verses were specifically revealed in regards to him. He said many verses were specifically revealed in regard to Nadhr ibn Haarith. And from those verses that he mentions is the statement of Allah, إِذَا تُتْلَى عَلَيْهِ آيَاتُنَا قَالَ أَسَاطِيرُ الْأَوَّلِينَ, that if the verses are revealed, are recited upon them, they say folk tales. Fine. Likewise, the saying of Allah, وَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ ممن افترى على الله كذبا أو قال أوحي إلي ولم يوحى إليه, that who's more oppressive, who's more unjust than the one who lies about Allah. This isn't, we haven't got into yet, but this is what the verse says. Who lies about Allah and who says أوحي إلي ولم يوحى إليه شيء, and he says I've received revelation. He says I've received revelation, but he hasn't received any revelation. وَمَنْ قَالَ سَأُنزِلُ مِثْلَ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهِ, or the one, and now this is what the point is, they say this is about Nadhr bin Haarith, or the one, so we're talking about who's more unjust than these types of individuals, or the one who says that I'll reveal and I'll bring to you, I'll bring down similar to that which they say Allah has brought down. Does that make sense? They say that's about that statement of who's more unjust than that individual who says that I'll come with that which is similar to what Allah has come with. They say that is in regard to Nadhr bin Haarith, because they say that his affair got so bad, his enmity was so bad, that it said that he would even try and replicate the Quran in terms of its rhythm, and he would come with his own thing that sounds like the surahs. Fine. It's even mentioned that every single verse in the Quran where it says Asatirul Awwaleen, this is mentioned from Ibn Abbas, who's obviously very knowledgeable in tafsir. We know that he's Turjamal al-Quran. The Prophet ﷺ made dua that Ibn Abbas understand and be given fahm of the Quran. It's mentioned from Ibn Abbas that he said every verse where Al-Asatir al-Awwaleen is mentioned, folk tales and legends, then it's talking about Nadhr ibn Haarith. Ibn al-Haarith. Fine? Whatever the case might be, whether that be authentic tafsir or there might be another more correct opinion, etc. Whatever the case is, whether those verses that we just mentioned were revealed in regard to him specifically, fine, or not, then we say all of those verses that we just mentioned, they apply as a refutation upon him and Nadhr bin Haarith, and likewise a refutation for anyone similar to him. For anyone similar to him, because they say the Quran, from the miraculous nature of the Quran is it's not, they say it has a generality within its meaning. And so even if it didn't come down specifically because of him, I can still apply the verse to him. I can still apply the verse to him, just like I can apply the verse to someone else who comes today and does a similar thing. Does that make sense? And we've probably seen like how verses of the Quran are so widely applicable that it doesn't necessarily, it's not restricted to its time. Fine, it's timeless. Fine. Even though it's specific, in many of its verses are revealed for specific scenarios, even those verses are timeless in that they can be applied to similar scenarios. Does that make sense? Rather, about Nadhr bin Haarith, we'll end with this one regarding Nadhr bin Haarith. It's even said that Nadhr bin Haarith, he's the one who made almost a supplication. He called out to Allah and said that if you are the truth, then rain upon me stones from the sky. He asked for punishment. That the level of mockery, he asked for a punishment. Does that make sense? He says, if this is indeed the truth from you, then rain upon me stones from the sky, or come with a painful punishment. He asked for that. Fine. And like we said, some of this, for example, this last issue of is he the one who said that or not, then this needs some form of what? Confirmation. We need to affirm this from some form of evidence. Fine. Tayyib, is there any questions up to here? Tayyib, very quickly moving on to the benefits. Fine, just a few benefits and we're done inshallah. The first benefit is for us to understand that any individual who busies people from listening to the Quran, he busies people from learning the Quran, learning their deen, he busies people from the path of Allah Azza wa Jal, then he has come with a very similar characteristic, similar approach. He's come with a similitude of the enemies of Islam. Rather, what he's doing is, we call it Sadd an Sabillah. It's as if he's blocking people from the path of Allah, just like the enemies of Islam used to at this time, and even still today and throughout history, have blocked people from the path of Allah, from the path of good, from the path of guidance, whether that be someone who did it through music, or whether that be someone who did it through some other form of distraction. Fine. Rather, the person who specifically does it, he distracts people and keeps people busy from guidance, busy from good, fine, busy from the path of Allah with music, then he specifically is similar to Nadhr bin Haarith, the exact individual that we mentioned, and all those verses that we said are very likely in regard to him. Specifically, he has a specific similitude to Nadhr bin Haarith, a very strong similitude. Why? Because it's mentioned about Nadhr bin Haarith that he bought a slave girl who was known, who could sing. It's specifically mentioned that he bought. That's how heavy his enmity was. That, and how strongly he utilized this means of distracting people. That he actually bought a slave girl who could sing, and any person who would come and ask about Islam, who wanted to meet the Prophet ﷺ, etc., inquire, then he would basically utilize this girl in distracting him, and her singing to distract him. Does everyone understand this? And keep him busy from that path. Fine. And it's even said that the verse in Surah Luqman, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَا يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ لِيُضِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Allah says in Surah Luqman that from the people is those who buy al-lahu, they buy distraction, they buy abath, fine, and they say that the meaning of this is like music. They utilize that لِيُضِلَّ النَّاسِ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, to misguide people from the path of Allah. And this is actually the main verse that they use for the prohibition of music. Fine. The second benefit, we don't have much time. The second benefit, which is clear, fine, from what we understood and from the previous things that we mentioned, and as going forward, is the high level and of the Quran, the value of the Quran. to the point that the Prophet ﷺ would present it to people and he would want people to listen to it. In any time, any place that he could, he would want someone to lend an ear to it and want to present it to people. Add to that, that the way that the kuffar tried to block people from listening to it, as we took here, how much conviction they had and how much effort they put into stopping people just from listening to it, is an evidence, a clear evidence with no shadow of a doubt, fine, the value and power of the Quran. Is everyone with me? Fine. And there's one more benefit, which will bi-idhnillah leave until next lesson. It's just one more short benefit. We'll mention it at the beginning of next lesson due to the shortage of time. Wallahu al-musta'an. Is there any questions? Everything generally clear? Fine. I know it's a bit quick, but we've generally finished now. We've finished this means, and we can go on to the next means, which is the means of parleying and trying to make a deal and come to some mutual ground. Fine. We're going to come to that means bi-idhnillah next lesson. Fine. If there's no questions, bi-idhnillah, we'll leave it there and we'll pick it up next lesson. If there's any questions, you can just contact me and I'll try my best to get back to you. We'll ask Allah for sincerity and to guide us that which He loves and is pleased. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. جزاكم الله خيرا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.